Hi, everyone. Welcome. Good evening. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Serena Longo, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm so pleased to introduce this virtual event with Mark Arsenault, presenting his new book, The Imposter's War, joined in conversation by Mike Stanton. Thank you for joining us virtually this evening. Harvard Bookstore's virtual event series continues this spring alongside our in-person programming, bringing authors and their work to our community and our digital community. Find our complete events lineup at harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and shop our shelves from home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and we'll get through as many as time allows. This event will also have auto-generated closed captioning available. Depending on the version of Zoom you're using, you may need to enable captions yourself by clicking on the closed caption button on your screen. You can disable captions there as well. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to pre-order The Imposter's War, to purchase The Imposter's War on harvard.com. Your purchases truly make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. So as always, thank you so much for tuning in and for your support. We sincerely appreciate it. And finally, as you have no doubt experienced in virtual gatherings these last couple of years, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you for your patience and understanding. And so now I'm so pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. Mark Arsenault has covered national politics, gambling, and worked on the Spotlight team investigations as a staff reporter for the Boston Globe, which won a Pulitzer Prize for its coverage of the Boston Marathon bombing. Before the Globe, he worked 10 years as a reporter at the Providence Journal. Joining him on our digital stage this evening is Mike Stanton, Boston Globe Spotlight Fellow and Journalism Professor at the University of Connecticut. They'll be discussing Mark's new book, The Imposter's War, the press, propaganda, and the newsman who battled for the minds of America. Booklist calls it well-researched and clearly written, and Publishers Weekly writes, his eye-opening account is a valuable look at both the ethics of journalism that prioritizes the ends over the means and century-old antecedents for foreign propaganda disseminated as part of a sophisticated scheme. Enthralling. We're so pleased to be hosting this event this evening. The digital podium is yours, Mark and Mike.
All right, thank you.
That's perfect. That was
Hello,
perfect.
Mark.
Well done.
How are you?
Well done.
Good to see you.
Hey, Michael, thank you.
And
Thanks for that new production.
Yes, and thank you everybody for joining us. I hope everyone's doing well tonight. I'm excited to be here with my former colleague, Mark Arsenault, from when we worked together at the Providence Journal. And this is such a terrific book, Mark. It's a compelling read about the secret life of a journalist who helped propel the United States into World War I. But the thing I like about it is it works on many levels. It illuminates a really fascinating period that's forgotten in our history, number one. Number two, John Ratham is a fascinating character right out of fiction. And it reads like a spy thriller that tracks back and forth between the intrigue surrounding World War I and John Ratham's secret life and bizarre and mysterious past. And what I really think resonates about it is it has a lot of meaning today because it's a tale of propaganda and misinformation in an era of fake news that we live in. And so, Mark, I guess I want to ask you, I know that your interest in John Ratham grew out of your time at the Providence Journal, and he was the editor of the Providence Journal way before we worked there, obviously, in the early 1900s. But when you set out to write this book, were you thinking about the modern parallels with fake news and propaganda?
Yeah, that was one of the things that sort of turned me on to trying to launch into this story. A long time after I'd heard of Ratham. I heard of Ratham, really studied Ratham for the first time in 2004 when I was at the Providence Journal, and I was assigned with another reporter to write a special section on the 175th anniversary of the newspaper. And so the first thing we did, facing a pretty big task like that, was to go back and look, what did they do 25 years ago at the 150th anniversary? So we looked at that work, and those guys had fallen deep into the Ratham vortex. And they had done a lot of research on him and had come to the conclusion in the late 1970s that he was probably not born to that name. He was probably an imposter. I finally decided to work at the book on the book in earnest in 2018 after I had done a piece on Ratham for a short piece called for a program known as Globe Live, which is something we do at the Boston Globe every now and then. There's one coming up in June that I'm going to be in, where reporters report original stories and then go on a stage in front of a live audience and tell those stories, with big art projected on the wall behind us, that sort of thing. It's like pop-up magazine, and I did this piece on Ratham, and it was really popular. And I think what resonated to people was it was about what are we reading that's fake? What are we seeing that's fake? What are we reading or seeing that's real? I mean, Ratham's entire life was fake. He was an imposter. His entire biography of great swashbuckling deeds was almost entirely made up. His name is not his name. His middle name, Revelstoke, I'm pretty sure he stole that from a Canadian mountain town outside of Calgary. So he was a fake character. He was an actor playing a really amazing role. He's playing the role of a swashbuckling journalist that is a player on the world stage. And he, by playing that role, actually made himself the very thing he was pretending to be. So definitely in the beginning, when I started really writing that first piece about Ratham, the part that popped with me the most is the thing that we can make relevant today, which is what's fake and what's real among the things that we read and see on TV or on the internet.
Thank you. World War I is not really as well known to Americans today as World War II is. World War II, we had very clear lines between the good guys and the bad guys. The Nazis and Hitler were clearly the bad guys. And World War I was much more complicated and forgotten today. So when we talk about the role of propaganda, and I teach a press history course at the University of Connecticut, where we talk about World War I is really the first propaganda war. And when it began with this whole complex, palace intrigue of European countries, it wasn't a foregone conclusion that the United States was going to get involved in the war. So could you kind of set the stage for us about what was happening here and why propaganda played such an important role?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So much about the activities in the book revolve around exactly this issue. Well, in Europe, in 1914, the war begins very suddenly. It's Germany and Austria-Hungary, known as the Central Powers in Central Europe, against the main combatants, France, Great Britain, and Russia. And all of these nations looked at the United States as the production capacity, the capacity to build weapons, capacity to develop, to send other goods, machine parts, cars, automobiles, livestock, all the things that you need to run and prosecute a successful war. The United States had all of those things. So right away, all of the countries involved in the war wanted to get the United States and the people of the United States on their side. From the very beginning, the British sort of had kind of a home court advantage with a common language, right? Didn't, material from London didn't have to be translated, like material from Berlin had to be translated before it could be published here in the United States. So that was a bit of an advantage. And probably most of the American reporters who covered Europe covered it from London. It's a big newspaper city. American reporters in London were steeped in British culture and history, and it was not hard for them to take sort of more of a British perspective from the war. But as far as what the American people thought, I mean, there was barely 90 million people in America, and there was 8 million German Americans, or the sons of German immigrants, sons and daughters of German immigrants. So that was a pretty big base for Germany. So it wasn't clear who the United States should be rooting for. The East Coast generally was for Great Britain. The Midwest, where there were a lot of German Americans, was generally for Germany. The South started out generally for Great Britain, but then as British trade policies and the embargo or sea embargo around Germany, it caused a lot of problems for American shipping and Southern exporters, and they started to not like that, and their loyalties drifted away from Great Britain, in the early years of the war. There was a poll taken by Literary Digest of newspaper editors around the country around this time. What do you and your readers think about the outcome of the European war? And of those with a preference, there were definitely more who favored Great Britain and France, but a good number of them favored Germany. It was unknown who the bad guys were at this time. Europe has wars all the time. No one knew at the beginning this one was going to be so much different than every other one that they had over the last, several millennia. So both sides of the war started immediately with propaganda in the United States. A lot of it was right out in the open. Here's a commentary written by the British ambassador that appears in the New York Times. Here's a commentary written by a German diplomat stationed in America that appears in the Saturday Evening Post, right? So that was just basic, straight public relations. So there was a lot of that going on. There was a lot of also what we call gray propaganda, which was stuff that's a little bit more insidious, which is propaganda that comes to you without any source attached. And all the nations involved were involved in this. And this was sort of Ratham's specialty. He published, as editor of the Providence Journal, lots of stuff that he got from British spies, mainly, and from another domestic spy operation here in the United States that favored the Allies, Great Britain and France. He published a lot of material from them, unsourced. So as a reader, you just don't know what to make of it because you don't have the source. You don't know the sourcing. You don't know how much weight to give that kind of material. And I think that happens now today all the time. You can't spend 5 seconds on Facebook without being hit by some kind of gray propaganda, some information that is formatted to look like news, but you don't really know where it's from. And so as a reader, we're sort of left a bit adrift as to how much weight we should give that kind of information if we don't know the source.
Yeah. So John Ratham steps into this kind of vortex of intrigue and propaganda. And I think where the intrigue comes in that you write about so well is beneath the surface of the open, clear propaganda there's these spy networks in New York and in the US and they're German and British and other factions in Europe, working both sides. And then there's the forerunner to the FBI is monitoring things. And John Ratham plugs into this network. And so can you explain to our audience how the editor of the Providence Journal up in Rhode Island becomes like really the most famous newsman of this era, quoted in the New York Times and, running national speaking tours. Why John Ratham?
Well, I say that John Ratham was a liar, a grifter, an extortionist, and the most famous newsman of his time. Trusted by millions of American newspaper readers, a confidant of President Woodrow Wilson, and yet, there's no evidence he ever spoke his real name on this continent. And he was an excellent reporter. He was Australian born. He came to North America, landing first in Western Canada in 1889, and right away started working at a newspaper. Quickly got in a lot of trouble because he used to have a scheme where he would write something derogatory about somebody prominent in the community and then bring a draft of that story to that person and say, wow, look at this terrible thing I just wrote about you. You would hate to see this published. But, for a modest fee, I can sand off some of these rough edges, or for a larger sum, I'll just throw it away. And so the level of sin against journalism that something like that would encompass is almost incalculable, right? But he got away with it for a while until he didn't, and he tried to extort a a pretty well-connected guy who was a interpreter for the courts up there, who was a Chinese immigrant of pretty good stature, and that person brought it straight to the police, and Ratham ended up escaping to the United States just ahead of the cops coming to arrest him. He worked up in the Pacific Northwest for a while, in Oregon and in Washington State, ended up at the San Francisco Chronicle, eventually worked his way into the Midwest, Chicago, and then to Providence. And by the time he got to Providence, he had actually amassed a pretty formidable reputation as a brilliant writer, which he was. He was a brilliant writer, which is why, despite being an extortionist and a liar and a fabulist, he kept getting chance after chance in journalism. And at the Providence Journal, again, he took over a paper with a really modest circulation of about 20,000, before the war started. And then the afternoon edition, which was known as the Evening Bulletin, that had a circulation of about 33,000. So his direct readership was minuscule. But what he did during the war, especially the 2 years before the US got into the war, so mostly 1915 and 1916 is where he really made his mark. He wrote one sensational story about German espionage, propaganda, and sabotage after another. He got these stories from the spy networks that he was connected with, and those stories are run on the front page of the Providence Journal. Also, on the same day they ran in the Journal, they would be running on the front page of the New York Times and the front page of other major newspapers all over the country, and in the following days in newspapers in every state and territory in the US. His words were rolling off printing presses in big cities and little towns all across America over those years, and it made him very famous. Later on, he'd become infamous when we'll get around to his speaking tour.
But how is it that all these national papers started picking up his stories? Was he reporting things that other newspapers didn't have? And if so, what was it about him that made all these spy networks decide that they're going to make him their go-to guy to leak their stories?
Yeah. Well, that's really amazing, is that even after all this time, how Ratham ended up connected with these spy networks is still a little bit of a mystery. I take a crack at it in the book, so what I think probably happened. But what is absolutely true is that Ratham was recruited into this network by British spies. Guy Gaunt was the name of the naval attaché for the British government stationed in New York during these years, and he was also part of the British spy network that's essentially stood up the spy and propaganda and espionage network in America for Great Britain during this time. Guy Gaunt recruited Ratham into this organization. Exactly how they connected, I really don't know. Gaunt's own story was that he was hanging around the British embassy in Washington one day, and he just saw some big guy standing around chewing on a cigar. And he asked if the guy needed help. And the guy said, "I'm John Ratham. I'm the editor of the Providence Journal. I'm also a native Australian," which would have made him a British subject, or he would have been born a British subject at the time.
Right.
So I figure it's time I do something for the old country. So according to Gaunt, which I think this is a total lie, according to Guy Gaunt, right away, he invited Ratham in and said, "All right, I'll feed you information if you publicize it and keep my name out of it." I don't believe that's true. I think that Gaunt and his other people he was involved with spying in the United States were fanatical about security, and they were not going to invite some big stranger into their organization 5 meetings after meeting him. So I don't think that's true at all.
Yeah,
I think much more likely is shortly before this, in the spring of 1915, Ratham was tricked by a German agent into running a story that was derogatory to the British government. It suggested that British ships were taking coal from tugboats that were putting out of New York Harbor in violation of America's policy of neutrality. And had this been true, this would have been a huge embarrassment for the British government, but it wasn't true. Ratham had been duped by a paid German agent into publishing that story, which I think Ratham at the time probably thought was true. And when the details of that story came out, the British agents saw it reprinted in the New York Times and reached out to Ratham with more facts, and I think the relationship developed from there. That's my best guess.
Okay, so let's talk about some of these sensational stories that Ratham had, because it's not really accurate, as you point out, to say that the stories he published were totally wrong. Right. I mean, we can talk about his methods, and he kind of inflated his role. He said that like Providence Journal reporters, went undercover and worked in these foreign embassies and, were firsthand purveyors of secret information. But some of that was to camouflage his real sources. So talk about some of the scoops he had that were real.
Right. Well, he ran a story one time that said that German interests were trying to buy big American weapons makers. And if they got control of them, then those weapons makers would no longer produce anything to be sold to Great Britain, which was, obviously would be detrimental to the British war effort. So to the point where the story was such a sensation that the Wall Street Journal on the front page of its paper actually printed the story saying, Bethlehem Steel, one of the companies that Ratham mentioned, would never fall into German hands. It could never happen. After the war, the German ambassador, a guy named Count von Bernstorff, admitted in his memoir that, yeah, we wanted to do that. We had plans to do that. We wanted to take over Bethlehem Steel. And if we had been quicker about it, and if the cash had come from Berlin quicker, maybe we would have been able to do it. And that could have affected the war effort later. So that story actually turned out to at least have a grain of truth to it. What I would consider Ratham's Mona Lisa would be the Hertha story, right? Where he wrote in 1915 now that German diplomats in the United States were trying to engineer a shooting war between Mexico and the US. Because if that was to happen, then the US would not permit any weapons exports to Great Britain or France, because it would need all the weapons produced in America for its own war here at home. Everyone involved in this story denied every word of it. Ratham was widely ridiculed in a lot of corners, and the story was met with a lot of disbelief and demands for proof, which Ratham couldn't deliver because he had to keep all his sources confidential. 2 years later, in 1917, the Zimmerman telegram, famous Zimmerman telegram, which was really the final push that pushed America into World War I, that was intercepted by the British, decoded by the British decoding operation in London, and leaked, given to President Wilson, and then leaked by the Wilson administration to the Associated Press. It appeared on the front page of every newspaper in the country, and it proved that Germany was trying to engineer a shooting war between Mexico and the United States, by which Mexico, if they agreed to this, would get back territory that it lost to the US in the 1840s in Texas and New Mexico and Arizona. It was unbelievable. People could not believe the level of duplicity that the German diplomats stationed in the United States had shown to what was supposed to be a friendly country. That was the final push that pushed America into the war. And I don't think that a lot of people remember that John Ratham published details of a similar plot fully 2 years earlier.
Well, let's talk about another defining story for him that also sheds light on his proclivity to exaggerate. Yeah. And that is the story, again, he talks about an attractive woman who works for the Providence Journal, who gets a job as a secretary and helps expose a spy plot. Could you tell that story?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great story. It's known as the Hart's story, right? And this, when Ratham went on the lecture circuit, the Hart story was like his free bird. Like this was the thing that people wanted to hear. You were going to see John Ratham because you were going to hear the Hart story. And so the setup of the story is that at the time, again, America is still neutral at this time, even though the war has been going on now for more than a year. The British Navy, the biggest navy in the world at the time, controlled the Atlantic, right? So Germany couldn't just send messages back to Berlin, right? The British also cut the Germans' undersea cables, so they couldn't telegraph messages either. So they were left with only a couple of choices. You could send things by wireless over the air, but then again, anyone can pick that up, and if your code is broken, then your message could be read. So they also ship stuff or smuggled documents on ships, right? So generally what would happen is a neutral ship, big cargo ship, would be full of crates. It would come to go to Europe. The British would intercept it, force it into a British port like Falmouth, where it would be searched for war contraband, anything that the British don't want the Germans to get. And then if it didn't have any of that, it would be sent on its way. So according to Ratham, this woman in the employ of the Journal, whom Ratham had placed undercover as the stenographer in the Austrian consulate in New York, had discovered a crate of secret documents that were being packaged for shipment on one of these cargo ships to Europe. And I just want to read you Ratham's words verbatim as he's telling the story. Now, he told this story for the first time in his first event on his speaking tour, which is in Toronto in 1917. Okay, so this is verbatim from a transcript of his remarks that was made after his speech. The day this box was to be finally nailed up, this young woman, under instruction, stayed late and ate her luncheon at the office. There were only 2 or 3 people left in the office during the lunch hour. One of them was Captain von Papen, the German military attaché, a man with a weakness, like a good many of us, for beauty and talent in feminine form. This young lady answered that description, and Captain von Papen proceeded to make love to her, sitting on this box, a packing case some 3 or 4 feet square. We could not possibly stop the box on this side, so the only thing we cared about was to identify the box by marking it, so that the British officers in the first port of call could get it from among the hundreds of other articles in the hold of that ship. This young lady, taking out a heavy red crayon pencil and listening to Papen's advances, drew sentimentally 2 large red hearts in the top of the box. And it was Captain von Papen himself who took the pencil and put the arrow through the hearts. So the punchline, the British authorities informed us, and we have their word for it, that was the method of identification of that box when it reached Falmouth.
So Cupid's spies strike.
Yes.
So what's the real story?
Well, the real story is the woman did not work for the Providence Journal. If this story is actually true, and I think it might be too good a story to actually be true, Ratham heard this story from the head of a domestic spy organization in the United States that was made up mostly of people of Czech background who had immigrated here from what was then Austria-Hungary. And they really wanted their native region, Bohemia, to be its own independent country. And to do that, they really needed Austria-Hungary and Germany to lose the war. So right away, they started organizing when the war started to see what they could do to help here in the United States, mostly spying on German diplomats and trying to beat up any intelligence that could be weaponized and then used against the Germans. So supposedly, this organization had a woman stationed in the Austrian consulate who charmed the consul general. Whether or not it's true or not, I don't know.
Do we know if there were actually hearts scribbled onto a crate to identify the?
You know, later on, when the U.S. government, the Department of Justice, turned against John Ratham and essentially blackmailed him into silence, the government tried to vet that story, and then were unable to do it.
So Ratham, how prominent a role does Ratham play? And there's this Ratham's cat who you rescued in your research. But how prominent a role does Ratham play in getting America into the war?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting counterfactual. If Ratham didn't exist, or if no one like Ratham exists, how would America have approached the war in Europe. Ratham took it as his mission to wear down America's resistance to war with news articles, wearing it down slowly like the wind wearing down a mountain. Remember, at the beginning of the war, America didn't exactly know who to root for. Woodrow Wilson proclaimed that it was the duty of every American to be neutral in the European war. So Americans didn't really see much of a reason to risk their sons fighting, thousands of miles away on battlefields that really seemed to have nothing to do with American lives. And Ratham took the American apathy towards the outcome of the European war and treated it as much an enemy as he did the Germans. Right? He made it his mission to get America into that war on the side of Great Britain. I mean, he was a criminal and a crime fighter, right? So he always thought he could do whatever criminal acts he wanted, so long as he balanced it off by crusading good works. And that was sort of a hallmark of his career, repeated many times. And he did it again in this case. So I think if you look, I think the people who confirmed Ratham's effect the greatest were the Germans. They knew what he was doing to them. And they felt the pressure that he was putting on them with this, relentless string of exposés. With the Germans denied almost every word that Ratham wrote, but not everything was false. And certainly people started believing him, and other newspapers starting to sound more like John Ratham as the time went on. The Germans tried a lot of ways to try to shut Ratham up. The ambassador to the United States, the German ambassador to the United States, wrote directly to the US Secretary of State, begging him to shut Ratham down, begging the US Secretary of State for the US government to disavow what Ratham was writing. Instead of doing that, 2 weeks later, the Secretary of State announced that two of Germany's top diplomats in the United States were no longer welcome here and had to go home because of the mounting evidence, much of it in the newspapers, that they had been involved in espionage and propaganda in violation of America's neutrality. A lot of that material came from Ratham's stories.
Yeah, and you mentioned that Woodrow Wilson, who was initially neutral and obviously ultimately supported going to war, that he had private conversations with Ratham and had Ratham to the White House. About that relationship.
Yeah, it's on. It's been on. You can find it on Ratham's. On Wilson's calendar. Meetings with John Ratham, personal meetings, one-on-one meetings with Ratham at the White House. I know at one point they talked very specifically about a plan that Ratham said one of the German diplomats in the United States presented to Ratham to present it to Wilson to say, hey, maybe if you could press American weapons makers to not sell weapons to the Allies, maybe Germany would make a signal that it was ready for a brokered peace, and Woodrow Wilson presumably would broker that peace. So according to Ratham and papers that Ratham exchanged with Wilson, the president, Ratham was involved in potentially some little backdoor diplomacy with Germany, which ended up not going anywhere because it was overtaken by events, namely the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915.
Interesting. So the other thing about your book, Mark, is that you cut back and forth between what's going on during this period leading up to World War I and during the war, and the different sorted chapters in Ratham's past. And I like the way it's almost like nesting dolls. We don't, and I'm not going to spoil the surprise ending. You should all read the book.
Yes.
Of his identity. But earlier on, you have this trail of hard to follow breadcrumbs of his infamous exploits in the Pacific Northwest, and then in San Francisco. And you wonder in today's social media world if he could have escaped his past so easily by moving from one place to another. But even then, he goes to San Francisco and becomes a pretty prominent newsman in a big Western city. And he gets involved in this incredible scandal involving his love life that does make like tabloid fodder and basically gets him to move on from San Francisco. So could you talk about the infamous case of the poisoned cherries?
Sure. Now that would be the second time that Ratham's name ever really appears nationwide in print. The first time it ever appears nationwide in print, it's when Ratham is stricken with yellow fever as a correspondent covering the Spanish-American War in Cuba. And it is reported nationwide that he was the last reporter left in the fever camp on Cuba and was close to death. He ended up surviving that, and then 6 months later got involved in this really tasty scandal. While on vacation in Fresno, apparently without his wife, Ratham met the acquaintance of a very beautiful 24-year-old woman from West Virginia who was in town as trying to make a living as a private lecturer, and had given a lecture about sort of the women's rights movement of the late 19th century. And she was very ambitious and very smart and cultured and schooled at really fine schools. And they became friends. And she moved back to San Francisco. Her name was Florence Campbell. She moved back to San Francisco and became friends with Ratham and his wife, Mary Ratham. And the two women were good buddies and exchanged letters back and forth, and they were quite close. And Ratham and Florence were in fact even closer. They started an affair. It wasn't that long before Ratham moved out and shacked up with Florence in San Francisco, not that far away, within walking distance of where he had been living with his wife. At first, Mary Ratham didn't really blame Florence for the affair. She blamed Ratham, and she wanted her husband back. Things got a little hot between the women eventually. They had a pretty loud argument where Mary Ratham finally put her foot down and said, look, either you break it off with him and swear you'll never see him again, or I will file divorce, and I will name you as a co-respondent, which means I will be outing you as someone having an adulterous affair with a married man. Again, this was 1899 at this point, so quite a big deal reputationally if that had happened to Florence. So shortly after that, Florence received some mail at her old landlady's house and went to go pick it up. It was a beautiful little package, blue wrapped in white twine. She opened it, and inside was a oblong wicker basket with a hinged lid, and inside that was about 1.5 pounds of candied cherries. And no note or anything, but the handwriting on the package was from Mary Ratham. That they were sure about. Although oddly, the handwriting had been clipped from an envelope. The address had been clipped from an envelope and pasted on the package. So Florence ate some candy, her landlady ate some candy, and that night got extremely ill. The candy was tested by a chemist who reported that it contained enough arsenic to kill a herd of cows. The police, of course, got involved. Someone who was trying to poison them. So Florence and the landlady did recover in a couple of days. Police investigation went on for weeks again, and this generated breathless coverage. This love triangle between Ratham, Florence, and Mary, and the poison cherries. This was a double-decker page-1 headline in the San Francisco Examiner. This was in the Times. This was in newspapers across the country. This was the second time Ratham's name was published nationwide. After a few weeks, the police managed to get their man. They tracked the articles, the basket, and the candies back to their cellars, a couple places on Market Street in downtown San Francisco. They brought Florence back in for another chat, and they arranged to have the proprietors of those stores at the police station. And when Florence came in, they ID'd her as the perp. And under questioning, she cracked, and she admitted that she had sent the poison candies to herself just to have something to hold over Mary, so she wouldn't be able to use her name in a divorce filing.
Wow.
The New York Times, the New York Times, the headline in the New York Times afterwards was just "Miss Campbell confesses," was the headline in the New York Times. The Times figuring that everyone had been hanging on this scandal now for days, and they would have known all the characters, so she didn't need any more identification than that.
Wonderful. I wanted to get to a few questions from our audience, Mark. And one question is that, with all these wild stories that you collected, is there anything that you wish you could have included in the book that wound up on the cutting room floor?
Yes, that's a great question. Yeah, I had always planned all along to have a chapter about government suppression of free speech during World War I in this country. That was a big deal. I mean, there was a movie maker who at this time made a silent film about the Revolutionary War, 1776, right? And because the movie depicted a U.S. ally in the war negatively, Great Britain, was sentenced to prison. The movie maker was sentenced to prison for this. Again, it's a movie about the Revolutionary War. It's going to depict Great Britain in a less than positive light. The suppression of speech throughout this country was, again, mortifying, and not just peer pressure or not just piling on people on Facebook. This was the government suppressing speech, shutting down ethnic publications that they didn't think were publishing things supportive of the war effort. The government, the Department of Justice, blackmailed John Ratham into silence, and then when Ratham pushed back later, they ruined his reputation. So I wanted to do a full chapter about that. The Committee for Public Information was something set up by Woodrow Wilson. It was essentially an official propaganda channel, propaganda committee set up in the United States, run by a former advertising guy named Creel. It was known as the Creel Commission, and they did a lot of just basic straight advertising propaganda, but then there was a considerable amount of suppression of free speech, not to mention the internment of thousands of German Americans and Austrian Americans in camps for no crime whatsoever, other than where they were from or where their parents were from. So I wish I had room for that, but I've always been told I write long, and I simply didn't have room.
And you did have a nice piece in the Globe magazine a few weeks ago about the free speech issue that you focused on a little more. One of the other things, so talk about, you kind of alluded to it just now in that answer. Talk about how Ratham fell out of favor with the government and what brought him down.
Sure. So after the U.S. was finally committed to World War I in 1917, Ratham went on a kind of like a victory tour. He went on a national speaking tour of major cities, right? Toronto, Boston, New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, Detroit. And in all of these cities, he spun some fantastical lies about how the Providence Journal had gotten all these scoops, saying that he himself were directing his reporters in a national counter-spy operation, infiltrating the German embassy and stealing documents and posing as other characters and overhearing phone conversations. And people had done those things. Spies had done those things. The spies that were Ratham's sources had done those things and had given Ratham the information. He had plagiarized their activities as his own, and in doing so became incredibly famous. He was shot himself into the upper stratosphere of American civic life. But these were lies, and some of the things he was taking credit for had been done by the Department of Justice, right? And the Department of Justice certainly knew what the truth was in those cases. Ratham also was in every city he went to, and I think he truly did believe this. He believed that everywhere he ever went was the most spy-ridden city he'd ever been in. And that got around, and people started asking a lot of uncomfortable questions, like, if a newsman knows where the spies are, why doesn't the Department of Justice do something about it? So the DOJ didn't like that, and they decided to shut Ratham up. And again, this was not This was not done out in the open. This was not done through any public hearing or anything like that. This was a couple of guys, probably not enough people for a decent poker game, sitting around one day saying, let's shut that big fat guy in Providence up. And they did. They subpoenaed Ratham to the grand jury with the intention of questioning him under oath about whether or not this information on his speaking tool was true. And if it wasn't true or he didn't have the evidence, then they were going to have the grand jury make a report that could be published. Ratham would be ruined. Ratham desperately didn't want to testify, but the only way to get out of it was to sign a confession, formatted as a letter to the Attorney General. This is the Attorney General of the United States, Thomas Watt Gregory. These were his terms. Ratham will sign a letter to me confessing to all the lies that he's ever told, and I will hold that letter. I will keep it secret, in fact, for as long as I think that's in the public interest. And that depends entirely on Mr. Ratham's behavior. So essentially, in order to get out of testifying, Ratham had to sign away his own freedom to speak. Yeah. He did eventually sign the letter, and Ratham had a very quiet year or two after he did that, before he couldn't really take it any longer, and he began to push back.
Yeah, and he strikes me as this guy who flew too close to the sun and didn't know when it was in his own good to shut up. And we don't have a lot of time left, so I'll kind of briefly summarize it and urge people to read the book to get the full amazing details of kind of after the war. There's a huge scandal in Newport, Rhode Island, which is this, home of a major Navy base at the time. And there's an investigation by rabid Navy brass who want to, expose homosexuals in their ranks. So they actually recruit undercover handsome agents to go have sex with homosexual sailors to expose them and prosecute them. And it becomes a huge scandal. Ratham writes about it and really blasts the Deputy Secretary of the Navy, who should have had oversight of this, one Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And this does not endear Ratham to Franklin Roosevelt. So could you talk about what happens next?
Well, in 1920, Roosevelt was the vice presidential nominee for the Democratic Party on the ticket with Governor of Ohio, John Cox. And so this is all unfolding in the backdrop of a critical national presidential election. Right, Ratham and Roosevelt are sniping, fighting, and it was just 8 or 10 days before the election that Ratham decided to hit FDR with what we now call an October surprise, and he published an open letter, essentially accusing Roosevelt of misconduct related to soldiers who had been imprisoned during the war for sex crimes, and whether or not those men were committed back to service. And this all sort of grows out of the Newport scandal, and the hatred between the two of them all stemmed and grew out of the Newport scandal. Roosevelt was desperate. He was about to go. He was on the ballot. He was about to face the entire nation in an election in just a week. So he writes to the U.S. attorney in New York saying, what can you do? Can you prosecute Ratham? What can you do to help me here? And that guy, the U.S. attorney, says, no, I can't prosecute him, but I know something else that can help in this situation. And so the Department of Justice released Ratham's confession to the press. And his reputation was obliterated. And the fact that he confirmed he told lies on the lecture circuit essentially tainted everything he ever did. Books written about World War I in like 1919, 1920, before Ratham was exposed, are really generous to Ratham and say that, he had a significant impact on the way Americans viewed the war, right? Books written after that, after he was exposed, are either brutal towards him, saying that everything he did was a fantasy, which was also not true, or they completely leave him out. And I think that was like the worst sentence that someone like Ratham could ever be sentenced to just by the writers of history, just deciding we just won't include him.
Cutting room floor. One of the other interesting facets, and this gets into how you research a book when all the historical figures are dead, is that FDR sent people to dig up depositions from a lawsuit, a civil lawsuit against Ratham. And in those files were all these damaging stories about his exploits in British Columbia and San Francisco. And tell us how you found that document.
Yeah, partially by luck, I think. Yeah, I spent a lot of time at the beginning of my reporting of this book, just reading old books on Ratham that have been digitized just through Internet Archive, stuff that was written 60, 70 years ago, just to see, how was he referred to, right after his death. He died in 1923. And in one of these books, I just found a footnoted reference to some material that originally the first batch of it I found was in the New York Public Library in the special collections. And I saw that, and that had a good amount of material related to Ratham's early days in the Pacific Northwest, much of it done in deposition form, sworn deposition form. So this is about as good of material as you can get coming from witnesses. I mean, were sworn documents at the time. These depositions taken around 1914 or so. And there was also a reference to, again, in the FDR Museum in Hyde Park, New York, in the library, there's files on Ratham. And I managed to get to the library actually in February of 2020, just as I was finishing the proposal for the book. At the time, we knew of COVID as a thing up in Seattle, right? It was everywhere, but we didn't know that. And I got there just days before the library closed for essentially the next 2 years. So I was able to go there, see all this Ratham material that FDR and his henchmen and his lawyers had collected in 1920 for a lawsuit. I mean, they were prosecuting a civil lawsuit against John Ratham, which in fact never came to trial. FDR sued Ratham for $500,000, which was a Titanic sum at the time. He lost the vice presidency. Warren G. Harding became the president. The Democratic ticket was annihilated that year. And Roosevelt's reputation really needed some triage. And he thought the best thing he could do for himself was to stomp what was left of John Ratham deep into the earth, which is what he intended to do. And they collected a massive amount of information, all the derogatory revelations about Ratham's character and the things he used to do in the extortion plots he used to pull up in the Pacific Northwest and in British Columbia. And they intended to destroy him with that. Until the summer of 1920, while sailing off the coast of New Brunswick, where his family had a camp, Roosevelt felt kind of funny, didn't feel well. Within a couple of days, he couldn't move his legs. Really never moved them again. He contracted polio and completely sent his life and political career down a very long and winding detour. It was 7 years before he would even run for office again. He let the lawsuit die for lack of action. He had bigger problems than trying to get his reputation back from the way John Ratham had besmirched it. So because of that quirk of history, John Ratham was never exposed in his own time, and that material sat untouched literally for decades until I touched it.
Yeah, that's remarkable. I love stories like that, and there's a lot more. Again, we're not going to reveal the secret at the end of the book. When you actually go farther than anyone else to actually, get to the core of Ratham's true identity, and it's a pretty amazing twist. I will say this, that you made some connections with his ancestors, right, or his descendants in Australia. Yeah, and they helped you piece things together.
Yeah, they did. I mean, again, you talk about luck. I mean, we always say in journalism, you make your own luck, which is somewhat true by working hard. But sometimes you're just really lucky. And I feel like in this case, I was just really lucky. And I managed through a weird odd circumstances to be connected with people that I was able to confirm were Ratham's distant relatives. Ratham had no direct descendants; he didn't have any children that we know of. But these people were descended from the same people as Ratham, and they would have been his extended family. One's a genealogist, one writes, narrative nonfiction. So, I mean, these are really good people to connect with. And they were delighted to hear this about their long lost relative they only knew as like a name in the family tree, which is not Ratham. And I was able to fill them in, and they were delighted. In fact, they invited me to speak at their family reunion a couple of years ago, and I did on Zoom. It was the middle of the night for me. It was a fine time for a reunion in Australia, and they've been very gracious and helpful, and a number of them are thanked in the acknowledgments in my book.
Great stories. I highly recommend the book, and I think there is information in the chat about how you could purchase it from the Harvard bookstore, a signed copy, I presume. I'll leave you. One quick question from a listener or watcher is they thought your cat really added to the program and wanted to know your cat's name.
That was Hops.
Hops.
Yes, he is 10 years old. And he runs the downstairs. His brother, Moose, he runs the upstairs. I don't run anything.
There you go. And finally, are there any lasting lessons that Ratham's story or your experiences exposing his story that you would like to leave us with for the modern world that we live in with all its trouble?
Yes. We in journalism, we are dedicated to the truth, right? So you have to find people to listen to or read who you can come to believe are dedicated to the truth. I know all the journalists that I've ever dealt with, and I'm certainly like this. If anyone was to ever make an error, you just get so angry about that. You just want to destroy the world if you make a mistake. We're so terrified about making an error. We just want to be accurate. And there are people who dedicate their entire lives to accurately giving people the information that they need. And so please find those people, seek them out and read them and watch them patiently.
Well, thank you very much. Again, it's The Imposter's War. Read it and be safe and have a good night. And thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you to the Harvard Bookstore, and thank you, Mark and Hops.
Thanks, Mike. Right on, buddy.
Thank you both. This was wonderful. And thanks to all of you out there for spending your evening with us. I do encourage all of you to check out The Imposter's War on harvard.com. I have left the link in the chat a couple of times. So just click on that and head on over. You can also come into the store. We have it on the shelf too. So on behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Mass, have a wonderful evening. Keep reading and be well. Thank you all. Good night.
Thank you.
Thanks. Take care, everyone.